Hello and welcome back to Thinking Deliberately. This is episode 16, which is about teaching deliberately. And if you've read my website or anything else, you'll know that that's also the title of one of my books, probably the fourth book. We're going to construct the thinking teacher. So let me start with something that every school teacher, university lecturer should hear. You never teach just one subject. If you teach maths, you're also teaching what certainty feels like, or history. You're looking at what evidence means. If you're teaching leadership, you're looking at what power is. But if you're teaching psychology, you're really teaching about what thinking is. If you teach adults, you're teaching adulthood itself. And every teacher teaches two subjects, the curriculum and themselves. Socrates also said that I can't teach anybody anything. All I can do is make them think. And when I'm in front of a room, that's exactly what I'm thinking. I'm not assuming that they're going to learn anything from me other than how to think. So the strange thing is that most teachers never realise this. They spend years improving lesson plans, learning outcomes, assessment methods, slides, anything like that. Maybe even the curriculum design, and all of that is usually very important. But beneath all of that sits a much bigger question. What kind of thinking environment am I constructing? That's the question I want to explore today. Because teaching isn't really about delivering knowledge. Teaching is about constructing the conditions in which another human being either becomes more capable of thinking or more capable of performing thought for approval. And we talked about this in the last episode. Those are not the same thing. Most of us have experienced both. Think back to the best teacher you've ever had. I doubt the first thing you remember is the lesson. You probably remember something much deeper. How they reacted when you got something wrong, whether they welcomed questions, whether they admitted not knowing, whether they made you feel clever or curious, whether disagreement was dangerous, on whether, was confusion allowed. I remember being very confused in my maths lectures, and my teacher, I think it was Miss McCready, she was brilliant. Whether the classroom felt like a place where thinking could breathe, and that wasn't accidental. They were constructing an environment. Now, think about the worst teacher you've ever had. Again, you probably don't remember many of the lessons. You remember the atmosphere, the embarrassment, the sarcasm, the feeling that there was one correct answer and somehow everybody else knew it. The constant performance. You learned something there too. You learned that education meant surviving authority. Well, here's the uncomfortable part. Neither teacher intended to teach you those lessons. But they taught them anyway, because every teacher teaches their relationship with thinking. Students watch everything, not just what we say, how we respond when challenged, how we respond when we're wrong, how we respond to uncertainty, or maybe even to silence, how we respond when somebody asks a question we weren't expecting. Long before students remember our subject, they remember our relationship with thought. That's why teaching is such an enormous responsibility. Not because teachers possess knowledge, especially with the days of LLMs, because teachers quietly define what thinking feels like. Constructive development theory looks at teaching slightly differently. Most educational models ask, what method should I use? CDT asks, what am I constructing? Am I constructing education as an information transfer, as an assessment, as a performance, or maybe compliance, as intellectual competition, or am I constructing it as awareness, as inquiry, as development? Because the answer changes everything. Imagine two lecturers asking exactly the same question. What do you think? Same words, but one lecturer already knows the answer they want. The question is really a test. The other genuinely doesn't know where the discussion will go. The question is an invitation. Same behavior, same question, different construction. Imagine giving feedback. One teacher gives feedback to remind students who's in charge. Another gives feedback because they genuinely want the students' thinking to become more sophisticated. Same words, different construction. And if you understand how students construct their thinking, maybe they're procedural in their thinking, or maybe they're options oriented. If they're procedural, they just do me a bulleted list, please, and tell me how well I did. If they're options, they might choose to have you speak to them about it, or maybe put it on a board and I'll write it down. I've done a bit of research on that as well. So imagine a classroom discussion. One teacher sees disagreement as disruption, another sees disagreement as evidence that real thinking has begun. Same behavior, different construction. And that's why technique can never be enough. There is no teaching method capable of rescuing low awareness. A teacher can use group work badly, reflection badly, problem-based learning badly, even coaching badly. I mean, the worst one is obviously artificial intelligence, using that badly. Even curiosity can become another performance if the teacher secretly needs students to admire them. Teaching isn't transformed by better methods. It's transformed by greater awareness. And this is where I think many educational systems quietly go wrong. We spend years teaching people how to teach, very little time helping them become aware of the self that is teaching. And that will be born of my andragogy PhD as well. So that's a profound omission, because the teacher walks into every lesson carrying an invisible curriculum. Their beliefs, assumptions, confidence, fears, relationship with authority. Do they need to be liked? Do they care? Are they okay with failure? Students don't just encounter the syllabus. They encounter everything. How the lecturer constructs themselves, usually without anybody noticing. And this is why I sometimes say something that surprises teachers. The most important thing you bring into a classroom isn't your lesson plan. It's your level of awareness. I call it dynamic intelligence, because awareness changes everything. A teacher with high awareness notices themselves becoming defensive. They notice the urge to rescue students too quickly, or they notice when they're talking because they're uncomfortable with silence. They notice when they're answering the question they wanted instead of the one the student actually asked. And they notice when they need to appear clever. And as they notice, that awareness creates choice, and choice creates better teaching. One of the biggest mistakes teachers make is rescuing too quickly. A student struggles, the room goes quiet, confusion appears, and the teacher immediately explains. We've all done it, and the other place I see this happen a lot is in front of adult learners, maybe even the C-suite when you're delivering a workshop to organizational leaders. If you're not comfortable with silence, as a lecturer, as somebody delivering the information, it's a really good practice to just say nothing and let the people in the room fill in the blanks. So I've certainly done it. But what if confusion isn't failure? What if confusion is exactly what development sounds like? What if an old way of thinking is just stop working, and if we rush in too quickly, we may save the student from the very moment that could have transformed their understanding? Good teachers explain. Thinking teachers also know when not to. And that requires judgment. Not a teaching manual, or it requires awareness. And I think this changes the role of the teacher completely. The teacher is no longer the person with the answers. The teacher becomes the designer of developmental experiences. And sometimes that means explaining, challenging, encouraging, even interrupting. And obviously saying, I don't know, without embarrassment. I think that's really key. Because one of the greatest gifts a teacher can give students is permission not to know everything. Ironically, that's exactly what many teachers were never given themselves. We often reward certainty, confidence, fluency, and performance, and then we wonder why students become frightened of mistakes. Perhaps they're simply copying us, because students are always copying us. Not our slides, not our PowerPoints, us. They copy how we disagree, how we think, how we admit error, how we use evidence, and how we respond to complexity. All of that's education. Everything else is content. And this matters far beyond schools and universities, because every leader teaches and every coach teaches, parents, prison officers, even the police, and every consultant teaches. We just don't call it teaching. Every conversation constructs somebody else's understanding of what thinking looks like, which means teaching isn't a profession, it's a human activity. The question is whether we're doing it deliberately. So here's today's uncomfortable question. If somebody spent a year learning from you, what would they actually learn? Would they learn your subject? Or would they learn how to avoid mistakes? Would they learn curiosity or compliance? Would they learn to think, or simply to perform thinking for approval? Because here's what I now think. The best teachers are not remembered because they know the most. They are remembered because they made thinking feel possible. And this is thinking deliberately. And today's uncomfortable thought is this. Every teacher teaches two subjects, the curriculum and their relationship with thinking. Choose the second one carefully. Thank you.